The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement like tired fingers. For most people, it was just another Tuesday, the end of a school day, the beginning of an evening. But for the boy, it was a sacred part of his daily ritual. His backpack, slung over one shoulder, was frayed at the seams and heavy with more than just textbooks. It carried the weight of a quiet, persistent dream. His name was Leo, and he walked with a purpose that wasn't just about getting home. His world was a symphony of ordinary sounds. The distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a passing bus, the laughter of kids playing a game of street ball that would only end when the streetlights flickered on. These were the sounds of his neighborhood, a place where every house had a story and every dollar was earned with sweat. It wasn't a place of shiny new things, but Leo had never felt poor. He had his family, he had his friends, and he had the guitar. It wasn't a fancy guitar. It was a beat-up acoustic, its once bright sunburst finish faded and scratched in 100 places. There was a nick near the sound hole from the time he tripped on the stairs, and a long, pale scar on its back where it had rested against a radiator for too long. His father had found it at a garage sale, tucked away under a pile of old clothes, for the price of a few pizzas. "It's got a soul," his dad had said, handing it to him. And he was right. The strings were a little tired, the frets worn down, but when Leo's fingers found them, the guitar sang. It didn't have the perfect, polished tone of something new, but it had a voice. It was a voice that sounded like home. Every day, his path home led him past a different world. It was a shop called Sterling and Sons Fine Instruments, and to Leo it was less a store and more a museum. The window was always immaculate, a single, bright spotlight illuminating the treasures within. Leo never went inside. The door looked too heavy, the air inside too still and silent. He was afraid his own heartbeat, loud with a mix of awe and intimidation, would disturb the peace. So he stood outside, a ghost on the pavement, his breath fogging the cool glass, and there it was. The reason for his daily pilgrimage, hanging on a velvet wall, angled just so, was a guitar from another planet. It was a 1950s Martin D-28, and Leo knew everything about it. He had read every article, watched every video, and memorized every detail he could from a distance. The wood was a perfect deep honey color, glowing under the soft light as if it were generating its own warmth. The inlays on the neck were perfect little diamonds of mother of pearl, and the headstock with its elegant C.F. Martin logo was a work of art. It looked perfect. It looked untouched. It looked like it held every perfect song ever written, just waiting for the right person to set them free. Leo would pull a small, worn sketchbook from his backpack. The pages were soft from use, filled with pencil smudges and detailed drawings of the guitar from every angle. He was trying to capture its essence, not just its shape. He drew the curve of its body, the way the light caught on the tuning pegs, the intricate pattern of the wood grain. It was his way of getting closer to it, of understanding it. He wasn't saving up for it. The price tag, which he had once dared to peek at through the glass, was a number with too many zeros to comprehend. It was a fantasy, a castle in the sky. The money in his pocket, crumpled and earned from odd jobs, was for a new set of strings for his own faithful guitar. A set of elixirs, the good kind. That was his practical, achievable goal, but the Martin. The Martin was something else entirely. It represented a kind of perfection he didn't believe existed in the real world. It was the sound of a professional recording studio, of a packed concert hall, of a life where music was everything and money was no object. He would press his forehead against the cool glass and close his eyes, imagining what it would feel like to hold it. The weight of it, the smoothness of the neck, the feel of the strings under his calloused fingertips. He imagined the sound it would make, not just loud, but full. A deep, resonant bass that you could feel in your chest, and a high end that rang out like a bell. Clear and true, sometimes he would get home, take out his own scuffed and humble guitar, and try to make it sound like the one in the window. He would close his eyes and play, his fingers dancing over the worn frets. He would pour all his longing, all his admiration, all his quiet hope into the music. And for a few moments, in the fading light of his small bedroom, the sound that filled the room wasn't the sound of a cheap, second-hand instrument. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated passion. It was the sound of a boy who understood that the true magic of music didn't come from the price tag, but from the heart that played it. He was just a boy from a regular neighborhood, with a regular guitar and an extraordinary dream standing on the outside looking in. And in his own quiet way, he was already playing the song of his life. The decision to finally cross the threshold of Sterling and Sons wasn't made in a single, bold moment. It was a slow, quiet decision that grew over weeks, fed by the jingle of coins in a glass jar on his dresser. He had finally saved enough. Not for the guitar in the window, that was a dream made of stardust and impossibility, but for a new set of strings. A set of elixir strings, the kind with the thin coating that made them last longer and feel slicker under the fingers. It was a small luxury, a major upgrade from the cheap, rusty ones that currently bit into his fingertips. This purchase was his ticket, his legitimate reason to walk through the heavy oak door and into that other world. The day he chose was a Tuesday, just like any other, but the air felt different. He walked past the shop, his heart thumping a little faster than usual, but this time he didn't stop. He kept walking to the end of the block, turned the corner, and took a deep breath. Then he walked back, stood in front of the door for a full 10 seconds, and pushed. The little bell above the door chimed, a sound much softer and more delicate than he'd imagined. The world instantly changed. The noise of the street, the cars, the shouts, the life was gone, shut out by a wall of thick, expensive silence. The air inside smelled of lemon polish and old wood, a clean, serious scent that made him feel like he should whisper. His sneakers, which felt perfectly normal on the pavement, now seemed to squeak accusingly on the polished hardwood floor. Every instrument, from the violins hanging like sleeping swans to the mandolins nestled in velvet cases, looked perfect and untouchable. He felt like a smudge on a pristine painting. Behind the long glass counter stood an older man with silver hair and a kind but serious face. This was Mr. Sterling. He looked up from a ledger he was writing in, his eyes giving Leo a quick, professional once-over. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. He simply waited. Leo clutched the crumpled $20 bill in his pocket, his palms sweaty. He walked slowly toward the counter, his eyes darting around, trying not to stare at any one thing for too long. He finally made it to the counter and cleared his throat, his voice coming out smaller than he intended. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm looking for some strings." Mr. Sterling nodded, his expression unchanged. "Acoustic or electric?" "Acoustic, elixir, light gauge," Leo replied. The words he had practiced in his head a dozen times sounding confident and sure. The shopkeeper turned to a wall of small drawers, each one neatly labeled. He slid one open and sorted through its contents with precise, careful fingers. As Leo waited, he couldn't help it. His eyes were drawn to the center of the room, where the 1950s Martin D28 now rested on a custom-made stand. It was even more beautiful up close. The wood seemed to have a light of its own, and the curves of its body were so perfect they looked like they had been carved by a river. He was so lost in it that he didn't hear the bell chime again. This time the sound was sharp, demanding, followed by a loud voice that shattered the shop's peaceful silence like a rock through a window. "No, listen to me. The deal is non-negotiable. They either take it or we pull the plug. I don't care about their sentimental attachment to the brand. It's just an asset." A man swept into the store, his phone pressed to his ear, his tailored suit looking like it had been sewn directly onto his body. He was followed by a faint, expensive scent of cologne and an aura of pure impatience. He ended his call with a sharp tap on his screen and slid the phone into his jacket pocket. His eyes, sharp and cold, scanned the room, not with appreciation, but with the air of a king surveying his land. Mr. Sterling straightened up from the drawer, the string pack in his hand. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice polite but a little tight. "Good to see you." The man, Finch, gave a curt nod in the shopkeeper's direction, but his focus was already elsewhere. He walked past the counter without a second glance and picked up a vintage ukulele from a display. He didn't hold it with reverence. He held it like a tool, turning it over, his thumbnail scraping against the delicate wood. Mr. Sterling winced almost imperceptibly. "Just browsing, Sterling," Finch said, his voice loud. Thinking of picking up something for the weekend house. Something that looks good on a wall. He carelessly placed the ukulele back, not quite in its spot, and moved on. His gaze swept the room, dismissing everything until it landed on Leo. Leo, who had been trying to make himself invisible, suddenly felt like a spotlight had been turned on him. He was still staring at the Martin, his worn backpack slung over his shoulder, his scuffed sneakers looking dirtier than ever on the immaculate floor. A slow, cruel smile spread across Finch's face. He saw the look on the boy's face, that raw, undisguised longing. It was a look he was used to seeing, but usually from people trying to sell him something. Here it was pure. And to him that made it a weakness. He strode over to Leo, his polished shoes making no sound on the floor. He stopped beside him, so close that Leo could smell the man's cologne. Finch gestured with a lazy, arrogant wave of his hand toward the Martin D-28. Admiring the craftsmanship, son. He asked, his voice dripping with a sweetness that was anything but kind. Leo felt his face get hot. He just nodded, not trusting his own voice. Finch leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, but making sure it was loud enough for Mr. Sterling to hear. It's a beautiful piece, isn't it? A real masterpiece. He paused, letting the moment hang in the air, savoring the boy's discomfort. Then he delivered the line, his voice suddenly cold and sharp as glass. Don't waste your time. You're too poor to even touch that, let alone play it. The words hit Leo like a physical blow. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Mr. Sterling stopped moving entirely. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights overhead. A hot, burning wave of shame washed over Leo, starting in his stomach and rising to his cheeks. He felt every eye in the shop was on him, judging him, seeing him exactly as the man had described him, poor, small, and unworthy. His first instinct was to turn and run, to escape the suffocating silence and the crushing weight of those words. He wanted to disappear. The silence that followed the man's cruel words was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It pressed down on the boy's shoulders, squeezing the air from his lungs. A hot, prickling feeling crept up his neck and settled in his cheeks, a bright red flag of his humiliation. He could feel the eyes of the shopkeeper on him, could sense the stillness of the few other customers who had been pretending to browse. Every one of them was a witness to his shame. His first instinct, a primal, desperate urge, was to turn and bolt, to push open the heavy door and run back to the noisy, familiar streets where he belonged, to disappear into the crowd and never look at this shop, or the man in the expensive suit again. His feet felt like they were glued to the polished floor. He looked down, not at the man, but at the worn toes of his sneakers. They were scuffed and dirty, a stark contrast to the gleaming perfection of the room. The man was right. He didn't belong here. His $20 for a set of strings felt like monopoly money in a world of real estate empires. He was just a kid from a neighborhood where the music came from car stereos, not from $1,000 instruments hanging on a wall like art. But then, his eyes shifted from his shoes to the worn, black guitar case at his feet. It was his shield, his voice, his oldest friend. He had carried it everywhere. It had been with him in his bedroom late at night when he was teaching himself his first chords. It had been with him in the park, its music blending with the sounds of the city. It was covered in stickers from local bands and small, unnoticeable dents that each had a story. It wasn't a pristine masterpiece. It was a living, breathing part of his life. The shame began to recede, not all at once, but like a slow tide going out, replaced by something else. Something cold and solid and clear. He took a slow, deep breath, and when he looked up, he didn't look at the floor. He looked directly into the millionaire's eyes. The man was still smirking, enjoying his power, waiting for the boy to crumble. But the boy didn't crumble. In a voice that was surprisingly calm and steady, he said, "You're right. I am—" The smirk on the man's face faltered for a second, confused by the agreement. He had expected a fight or tears or a quick, defeated retreat. He hadn't expected this quiet acceptance. The boy let the silence hang in the air for a moment longer, a silence he now controlled. Then he gestured down to his own case, his movements deliberate and sure. "But this one," he said, his voice clear and strong, filling the quiet room, "this one I can afford. And this one I can play." Without breaking eye contact, he knelt down. The sound of the case's latches clicking open was sharp and definite in the stillness. He lifted his guitar from its worn cocoon. It looked exactly like what it was, a cheap, well-loved instrument. The finish was dull in places, a scratch ran along its side, and one of the tuning pegs was slightly bent. It looked out of place like a farmer in a ballroom. But to the boy, it was everything. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't look for a chair. He simply sat down on an empty wooden bench that was meant for customers to try out instruments, settling the guitar on his lap as if he were born to do it. He closed his eyes for a brief second, his fingers finding the familiar positions on the fretboard. The shopkeeper, Mr. Sterling, took a half step forward as if to stop him, then froze. His curiosity getting the better of him, and then the boy began to play. He didn't start with a loud, aggressive chord to prove a point. He started with a single, bending note that seemed to cry out from the very soul of the cheap wood. It was a sound filled with a lifetime of stories. It was the sound of struggle, of scraped knees and rainy days, of hope that refuses to die. He slid into a blues progression, a raw, earthy melody that felt as old as time. His fingers, not perfect and polished, moved with a purpose that was breathtaking to watch. They were sure, they were strong, and they were telling a story. The music filled the pristine shop, chasing away the sterile silence and replacing it with something alive and breathing. It was a sound that the expensive, silent Martin in the window could never make. That guitar was perfect, but it was empty. This boy's guitar was flawed, but it was full. Full of emotion, full of life, full of a truth that no amount of money could ever buy. The notes weren't just clean and precise. They were dirty and real. They growled and they wept. They whispered of heartache and then shouted with joy. The boy was no longer just a boy with a guitar. He was a conduit for every feeling that everyone in the room had ever had but could never express. The shopkeeper stood mesmerized, the pack of elixir strings forgotten in his hand. He had seen virtuosos play in his store, famous musicians with flawless technique. But this was different. This wasn't technique. It was truth. The other customers had stopped pretending to browse. They were watching, completely captivated, their faces softened with a shared, unspoken emotion. The power in the room had shifted so completely that it was almost tangible. It no longer lived in the man's expensive suit. It lived in the hands of the boy on the wooden bench. The man himself, the millionaire, was frozen. His smug expression had melted away, replaced by a look of utter shock. He stared, not at the boy's face, but at his hands, at the old guitar, as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. He was a man who understood price tags, who understood assets and leverage, but he had no framework for this. This was a language he didn't speak, a power he couldn't buy or bully. The boy's music was stripping him of his armor, leaving him exposed and small. The last note hung in the air, vibrating with a raw energy that seemed to make the very walls of the shop hum. Then it faded into a silence that was more profound, more respectful than the one that had come before. No one moved. No one spoke. They just let the echo of the music settle in their hearts. The boy had answered a sneer not with a retort, but with a revelation. And it was absolutely legendary. The last note didn't just end. It dissolved. It hung in the air like a ghost, a soft, vibrating hum that seemed to soak into the polished wood of the floor and the velvet-lined walls of the display cases. The silence that followed was a living thing. It was not the empty, sterile silence that had existed before the boy began to play, nor was it the heavy, suffocating silence that had fallen after the rich man's cruel words. This was a sacred silence, a shared space created by the music. It was a silence so full of feeling that it felt louder than any noise. No one dared to move, no one dared to breathe. For fear of breaking the spell, the shopkeeper, Mr. Sterling, stood frozen behind the counter. The pack of elixir strings, the very reason the boy had entered the shop, was still in his hand, but he had forgotten all about it. His professional, slightly reserved demeanor had melted away, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. His eyes, which had seen countless instruments and musicians over the decades, were wide with a wonder he hadn't felt in years. He was looking at the boy, but it was as if he were seeing something more than just a teenager with a guitar. He was seeing the music itself, given human form. The other customers, who had been politely browsing, were now statues scattered around the room. A woman in a business suit, her phone still in her hand, had a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. An old man with a beard, who had been examining a banjo, was nodding slowly, a deep, knowing smile on his face. They were no longer individuals in a shop. They were an audience, bound together by a shared, powerful experience. Their collective gaze was no longer one of curiosity or judgment, but of profound respect. They were looking at the boy not as a poor kid from the street, but as an artist who had just laid his soul bare for them all to see. And then there was the man in the expensive suit, Mr. Finch. He was the only one who seemed to be shrinking in the silence. The power and confidence that had clung to him like an expensive cologne were gone, evaporated by the raw honesty of the music. His face, which had been a mask of smug amusement, was now a complicated canvas of emotions. There was shock, a deep, profound confusion. He was a man who understood numbers, leverage, and the price of everything. He had just witnessed something that had no price tag, and his mind couldn't process it. He tried to regain his composure, to straighten his tie and reclaim his air of superiority, but it was like trying to hold water in his hands. The boy's music had stripped him bare, revealing a hollow core where his wealth used to be. He looked at the boy, who was still sitting on the bench, his head bowed slightly over his worn guitar. The boy wasn't gloating. He wasn't even looking at him. He seemed lost in the aftermath of his own creation, exhausted and vulnerable. This made Finch feel even more insignificant. He had tried to crush this boy with his wealth, and the boy had responded with something so powerful that it made his millions seem like pocket change. The humiliation was a bitter taste in his mouth. He opened his mouth to say something, to retake control of the room with a sharp, cutting remark, but no words came. What could he possibly say? Your technique is flawed? That guitar is junk? It would sound like the desperate whimper of a defeated man. Instead, he just stood there, his face growing redder by the second. The silence was no longer sacred. It was a judgment. Every second that passed felt like another nail in the coffin of his pride. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he turned on his heel. His movements were stiff and jerky, a far cry from the effortless swagger he had when he entered. He didn't say goodbye to the shopkeeper. He didn't look at anyone else. He just marched toward the door, his polished shoes squeaking softly on the floor, a sound that now seemed pathetic and small. He shoved the heavy door open with more force than necessary, and the little bell chimed, not with a soft, welcoming tone, but with a sharp, angry clang that echoed his undignified exit. The door swung shut, and he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of his cologne and the overwhelming power of the boy's music. The room seemed to take a collective breath after the door clicked shut. The spell was broken, but the magic remained. Mr. Sterling slowly, deliberately, placed the pack of strings on the counter. He walked out from behind his domain, his steps quiet and careful. He approached the boy not as a shopkeeper approaching a customer, but as one human being approaching another. With a deep sense of reverence, he stopped a few feet from the bench, not wanting to intrude on the boy's space. The boy looked up, his eyes still a little distant, as if he were returning from a long journey. "Son," Mr. Sterling said, his voice soft and thick with emotion. That was the most honest thing I have ever heard in this store." The boy, Leo, just looked at him, not sure how to respond. He felt a blush creeping up his neck again, but this time it wasn't from shame. It was from the unexpected praise. "I've had world-famous musicians play in here," the old man continued, his eyes twinkling. "People with perfect technique and million-dollar instruments. But they were just playing notes. You were telling a story." "Thank you." Leo just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He tightened his grip on his guitar, his anchor in this surreal moment. Mr. Sterling smiled. a genuine, warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He looked from the boy's face to the guitar in his lap, then over to the pristine, silent Martin D28 still standing on its display stand. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "that guitar in the window. It's a beautiful piece of wood, but it's been waiting a long, long time for someone to play it like that. It's been waiting for a story." He looked back at Leo, his gaze clear and direct. "I think it just found one." The old man's words hung in the air, soft and warm like a blanket. "Thank you." The boy, Leo, didn't know what to say. He felt a strange mix of exhaustion and elation, like he'd just run a marathon and won, but could barely stand. He just nodded again, a small, shy gesture that felt completely inadequate. The weight of everyone's attention was still on him, but it was no longer a crushing weight. It was a supportive one, like a gentle hand on his back. He suddenly remembered why he had come into the shop in the first place. The strings. The whole reason for this surreal, life-altering moment. He stood up, carefully placing his guitar back into its worn case, the click of the latches sounding like the end of a chapter. He walked back to the counter, his steps a little more confident than when he had first entered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled $20 bill, smoothing it out on the polished wood as best he could. "For the strings," he said. His voice still a little quiet. "Mr." Sterling looked at the bill, then back at the boy's face. A slow, kind smile spread across his features. He gently pushed the bill back toward Leo. "No, son," he said softly. "These are on the house. In fact," he paused, reaching under the counter and pulling out a small, flat cardboard box. "Take these too." He slid the box across the counter. Inside, nestled in black foam, were 3 more packs of elixir strings. Leo's eyes widened. I can't," he stammered. "This is too much." "It's not enough," Mr. Sterling corrected him, his tone firm but gentle. "It's an investment in music that matters." He leaned forward on the counter, lowering his voice. "You know, I bought this shop from my father. He built it from the ground up. He always said that an instrument is just a block of wood and some wires until someone with a story puts their hands on it. Today you reminded me of that. You gave that old guitar a voice, and you gave everyone in this room something to think about." The old man stood up straight, a thoughtful look on his face. "I have a proposition for you, Leo. I could use some help around here. Not just dusting and stocking shelves. I need someone who can talk to people. Kids, especially. Kids who come in with their parents, eyes wide, feeling like they don't belong because they can't afford the shiny guitars in the window. I need someone who can show them that the music is already inside them." Leo's heart started to beat a little faster. "You mean a job?" "I mean a partnership," Mr. Sterling clarified. "You can work here after school and on weekends. I'll pay you, of course. But more importantly, you can give lessons to the beginners. The ones who are just starting out, who are nervous. You can teach them what you know. You can teach them that it's not about the price tag, it's about the passion. What do you say?" Leo was speechless. A job in this shop, a place that had once felt like a museum he could only admire from the outside, was now offering him a key. He looked from the old man's kind eyes to the box of strings on the counter, then back to the worn guitar case at his feet. This wasn't just a job offer. It was an invitation into a world he had only ever dreamed of. He found his voice, clear and steady. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that very much." That day marked the beginning of a new song in Leo's life. He started working at the shop, and the place slowly began to change. The sterile silence was often replaced by the sound of a student's fumbling first chords, followed by Leo's patient encouragement. He was a natural teacher. He didn't just teach music. He taught confidence. He would tell his students, most of them young and from families like his own, the story of the day he answered a sneer with a song. He never used the rich man's name. He just called him the man who forgot that music doesn't have a price. The story of that afternoon became a local legend. It was told and retold in music circles, in coffee shops, and at open mic nights. It became known as The Legend of the Boy and the Martin. People who weren't even there would swear they were, adding their own details to the tale. The story wasn't about a rich man being put in his place. It was about the power of authentic art to change the atmosphere of a room and the course of a life. Leo became a respected figure in the community, not because he was a famous rock star, but because he was a keeper of a deeper truth about music. Years passed. Leo grew from a shy teenager into a confident young man. His own playing, always heartfelt, had become more refined, more nuanced. He never did buy the Martin D28. It no longer called to him in the same way. He had found his own voice, and it was more than enough. One sunny afternoon, Leo was tuning a small guitar for a young girl, her pigtails bouncing with excitement. The bell above the door chimed, and a tourist couple walked in, their cameras out. They were immediately drawn to the window, to the vintage Martin D28, which still held its place of honor on its velvet stand. It looked as perfect and pristine as ever, but now there was something new. Next to the guitar, mounted on the wall with simple brass screws, was a small, unassuming wooden plaque. It wasn't flashy or ornate. The tourist couple leaned in to read the elegant, hand-carved lettering. It didn't say, "Price, $25,000, or vintage 1950s Martin D28. It said something else entirely, for the music that money can't buy. The girl's father read it aloud. A little confused, Leo overheard him and smiled. He finished tuning the small guitar and handed it to the little girl. "Go on," he said. "Try a C chord." The girl pressed her small fingers onto the fretboard and strummed. The sound that came out was clumsy, a bit buzzy, but it was full of effort and a budding love for music. It was the most beautiful sound in the shop. Leo looked past her, through the window, and his eyes met the reflection of the old Martin guitar. He didn't feel the old longing anymore. He just felt a quiet, deep sense of peace. He had answered a sneer not with anger, but with his soul, and in doing so, he had found a richness that no millionaire could ever possess. He was home.